Our guest today is Professor Joseph Jerko from the Wharton Real Estate Department, and we're going to talk with him about the latest changes in Chinese land prices. Joe, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
It was a while ago that we had done the first piece about the China Land Index that you have developed with some of your colleagues. Can you tell us the latest update from the Wharton Tsinghua NUS Chinese Residential Land Price Index?
I sure can. And the latest data are from the third quarter of 2014, so they're hot off the presses. And there are two interesting things about the data. Number one is we saw a 6.5% decline in real land prices across the 35 cities in our index. So that's the first significant decline in some time. It takes the price index level back about 5 quarters ago. I think the second thing that I think is potentially more interesting and maybe foreboding for what might happen in China is the decline in the quantity of land sales from local governments in the 35 markets we track to private developers who want to build residential complexes. That number is down 44%. That takes us back to levels of transactions volume we saw 5 years ago, not 5 quarters ago. So the very large decline in transactions volume, much more modest, but a real decline in prices.
What factors do you think are driving these changes in China's land prices?
I think a couple. Number one is growth is slowing. China's not in a recession. I don't believe they're going to go negative. But remember, they've dropped from 10% annual price growth to 7.5% now, with many people wondering, are they going to go even lower? Well, think about how many housing units you need if you're going to have 10% growth in your economy versus 7.5. In the United States, we would love to have 7.5% growth, but it's 25% below the 10 they were having. So I think what's happening is developers were building and buying land for 10% growth. They got 7.5, and you no longer need as much. I think that's by far the most important factor. I think another factor that's out there, and we'll know more about this at the end of the year when we report our city-level indexes, is that different cities look to be doing very differently. So inside China, there's an awareness that shipbuilding and steel have excess capacity. So markets with a lot of shipbuilding and steel production activity, I suspect, are going to decline more than others. So I think there are two factors going on.
What do you expect going forward, let's say in the next few quarters?
I wish I knew. So that's why we're doing the index, so I'll know. What I suspect is we're going to see variation at the city level. That's number one. I think we'll find that some cities are doing just fine and other markets are not doing so fine. And we have 35 in our index, so we should be able to see a lot of variation across markets and across the countries. We don't just track Beijing and Shanghai and Guangzhou on the coasts of the country. The second thing I think to look for are changes in policy. It's clear in our data, if you look at our index, that Chinese government policy can move the housing market. So there was a similar decline in transactions volume in 2008 in the financial crisis, and it was rapidly turned around by Chinese government stimulus policy. We see a very large decline in transactions volume recently. The question, and I think what we ought to look for, is are we going to see a change in policy? I don't know, but it's happened in the past. I kind of doubt it, but I don't know. But I think we need to look at what the Chinese government's going to do going forward.
Great. And just one last question. Based on what the data show, what do you think are some of the implications for investors and real estate developers?
Well, I think real estate developers clearly inside China are becoming more cautious. That's why you're seeing the drop in transactions volume. In the U.S. and in most other countries I've studied, drops in transactions volume precede or lead drops in prices. So I suspect they're looking at those same studies and going, we're worried about price drops, and they're worried about shoring up their capital structures to make sure they're safe if there is a further downturn. I think that's what people are trying to figure out. Is the quantity drop a predictor of price drops? And it has been in other countries.
Joe, thanks so much for speaking with Knowledge at Wharton.
My pleasure.